Glen and I were fortunate enough to head down to Nintendo's Windsor Studios to play The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, and it was quite delightful, and we've got quite a few thoughts to share based on our experience.
Yeah, we played, was it about 80 minutes worth of it? Got to the first boss, beat the first boss. So yeah, we've got some extensive thoughts as to how we feel it's going to play out when it releases, which is very soon, and we'd like to share them with you now. What exactly are those thoughts? Well, let's find out.
The big and most obvious thing with this one is that you take on the role of Zelda and you're joined by Tri, who gives you an ability to essentially clone items in the world and use them to solve puzzles.
Yeah, this process is called echoes. Every time you create something or duplicate it, it creates an echo of that object. And you'll find yourself early doors, well, literally locked behind a door in the castle dungeons, sentenced to death actually. It's quite strong for a Zelda game.
Yeah, I will say we cannot show you solutions to puzzles. You wouldn't want that anyway because it would be a big spoiler, so don't expect to see any of the solutions. We'll just show some of those echo mechanics. Now basically every time you stumble across a new item, it will flash within the world and you can hold the trigger down to essentially learn that thing, and it's logged within its own space that you can then go and access. Now you can quickly switch between all of those by moving the D-pad left and right, and they'll slide across the screen. It's pretty intuitive. And the way that you use them, and I guess this is the big selling point of the puzzles in this game, is completely up to you. So you can use things differently, and every person will use different methods.
Yeah, it may well be that you don't actually echo something early on in the game that would have solved a problem later on, but as Mark just said, there are multiple ways to solve each of the problems that you'll come across, or the environmental puzzles. And it's quite nice to, obviously because we were in a room with a number of people playing it, whilst you are attached to your own screen and focusing on what you are doing, just hearing the murmurs of how other people solved things or the little bits they found, it does lend itself to a few different playthroughs, or at least a bit of out of the box thinking at times.
Absolutely, and while not giving you a solution, I can give you an example. So I was playing through and I'd found a small creature, and remember that you can also echo enemies and then spawn those to fight for you. I'd found a little flame creature, and the person next to me hadn't found that. Now in the next room there was a torch, I lit it straight away using that creature, but the guy hadn't done it. So I think what he did is he picked up a bed and then set that on fire and ran that across the whole level while it was burning to finish the puzzle. It was very clever.
Yeah, and that things like beds and boxes, crates, flower pots, whatever you may want to think of, you use those to kind of navigate the areas as well, don't you? So it's not just about echoing enemies to fight for you, as Mark just said, but you will find times where just getting across the gaps in the levels, and it is played, I must say, from a top-down view, obviously very reminiscent of Link's Awakening, the remake, but with that game as well, it does have those side-on moments that you find, especially in dungeons, and again, using items to get across gaps is quite a big part of the puzzle solving.
Yeah, you can do the classics, things like spin attacking leaves and shrubs to get little rupees and gems, and there are lots of little hidden areas. As we worked our way through the demo, Glen was on one side, I was on the other, and he was going for all the pieces of the heart pickup, weren't you? And you had to use those items to get there.
Yeah, early on in the demo there was 1/4 of the heart. You collect the 4 to get an extra heart piece, or an extra heart I should say, sorry. And it just occurred to me that if this was the part of the game they were showing you, there must be 4 within this part. And there were, thankfully, so I spent a lot of my time finding those and then had to rush to try and beat the boss, which I did do. But yeah, it was just fun trying to find those little bits. And again, obviously each one comes with its own puzzle to solve to get those extra bits as well, which just adds to the challenge of the game overall.
Now the world is corrupted by this, it's not like a miasma, but it seems to be tearing rifts throughout the universe, almost opening up a parallel universe, but it also blocks some of your paths so that some of the dungeons that you undertake will then clear sections for you to progress. Now, although we can't confirm it, it did seem to have the structure that there's the potential that you'd be able to approach dungeons in a different order rather than just one set way.
Yeah, it certainly gave the impression that you could approach the dungeons in a different order depending on which of the rifts you approached at any one time. It'll be interesting to see when the game drops if that is the case or not. If so, it was definitely, or looked at least like a nod to A Link Between Worlds, where you could pick up or rent the weapons in any order you wanted and then take on the dungeons using those weapons.
What many of you are going to be thinking about, probably, and wondering is how the dungeons actually feel, how they play, what's the layout and structure of them. So we'll go through the dungeon that we played through.
Yeah, it's very classic in terms of the layout. If you think of any top-down Zelda game from the past, then you'll get an idea as to how this one works. So you'll be finding small keys to open doors, hitting switches or laying blocks on a switch panel to try and activate something or open a door again. And there's also like a master key that you need to find in order to gain access to the boss room. And obviously then beating that boss will give you something that allows you to move on, a reward of some description.
It's interesting to see the influences of games like Breath of the Wild and the Tears of the Kingdom with the Ultra Hand, because you have an ability that allows you to lift up blocks and solve puzzles with that. So it almost has that feeling of physics-based puzzles at times. You can definitely see they've learnt a few things and managed to make traditional dungeons using those formulas.
Yeah, there's something else I want to mention about Breath of the Wild in a moment, but you're right. So you have the ability to bind two objects or to bind them to you. And the reason I say that two ways is because there are two different types. In the one hand, as Mark said, your movement will be replicated by the object, and you can move things out of the way or move them onto something. It may be that there's a switch panel on the other side of a chasm, and you can position yourself so that the rock you're bound to will then make that gap, and you can lay it where it needs to be. But at other times, you'll be tethered to something, and its movement will guide you. So it could be that you attach yourself to a moving block, and that will get you across a gap and allow you obviously to move on further. So having those two different types of abilities was a nice touch, and as you said, it did make for some interesting level design and puzzles.
Yeah, I found that the animation of that wasn't particularly to my taste. You kind of completely lock in position and it moves across. It looks a little janky. It feels like there should be some kind of physics waiting just to bob her or some movement, you know?
Yeah, it's very classic top-down Zelda. You know, those times where you kind of would have locked Link into place by holding down the attack button or anything like that, when you just move in one direction and don't move again and the character just stays still. It had that feel to it. A nice little nod, but I do appreciate what you mean, yeah.
So outside of dungeons as well, you've got an overworld map area, and the map gradually fills in. It's almost drawn in as you move about the environment. Again, something we've seen quite a lot. I was trying to break the game a little because you've got so many different tools you can access. It lets you like almost jump into areas you normally wouldn't be able to go to.
Yeah, I did see you like laying beds on trees and seeing if you could make a bridge to somewhere that there was nowhere to go. But on the map itself as well, you had like warp points. Yeah. Again, nothing we haven't seen before, but it's all implemented well, and you can walk from set points in one dungeon to make backtracking a bit easier if you're looking for something. And the point I wanted to make earlier about Breath of the Wild does relate to kind of the outside and the wild that you walk into, ironically enough. And that was there was a moment where I found like a moblin fort, which obviously you did have in the Breath of the Wild game, where you could attack them, be quite stealthy, blow them up with arrows and whatnot. And here I wanted to try and beat these moblins without being seen. So I had a moblin of my own, an echo, that I was going to use to attack them, but I laid a piece of meat down first to distract them. They go and eat the meat, obviously. That was the thinking. But my moblin, when I put him down, went and ate the meat, which I just thought was a nice little touch, you know, a nice reference to that game, but just a very clever way of what seemed like quite a logical plan not quite working out.
Yeah, it's full of Nintendo-isms.
Yeah.
You know, you can get the jars and you can hide in the jar and then like Metal Gear Solid stealth your way across and duck down. Following you at all times, you've got a number of triangles which represent your current Echo power, with different Echo summons basically requiring different amounts of these. For example, there's one enemy that you collect that's like a flying, spinning spike creature. I don't know what it's called. Someone watching this is like, it's called one of those. And he requires 3 to summon. So obviously you need to be careful with when you use them, because if you've got that out, you're not then going to be able to summon a rock or something else.
Yes, and you could obviously summon 3 smaller enemies that require just one of those triangles each and go for more of a brute force effort or surrounding an enemy. And also on that, you can have, initially at least, you can have 3 objects on the screen at any one time. I don't know if this will change later on in the game. And if you create a 4th, the first of those 3 that is on the screen will disappear. So just again, something to think about.
Finally then, you've got one thing that was shown in the recent trailer, and that's that you can transform into Link, almost like a spirit version of Link, to perform the standard attacks you'd be used to in a Zelda game.
Yeah, it was funny because as we were playing through, I did start to think it would be nice to have some sort of attack that wasn't related to the echoes, just for enemies that don't require as much work to defeat. Scrolling through menus just seemed perhaps, you know, a bit over the top at times, and then you do unlock this ability, which was nice, and it's tied to like a magic meter of some description. But it was nice to see that in there. At this point, at least, from what we've played, I don't think it is to the point where it almost renders the new features redundant. I think it's a nice mix of the two. I think it works very well.
Final note then, before we move on to visuals and performance, and that's on difficulty. It's actually a reasonably challenging game, isn't it? It's not an easy experience.
Yeah, I think the fact that the mechanics are so different, perhaps some of it, for me at least, was fighting muscle memory of what you usually do in a Zelda game, a top-down Zelda game, where you're expecting to do certain things and having to change your way of thinking. It does start to become second nature as you go on, but there were certainly, even in this early segment, you know, some parts which were either puzzles that took a few moments to figure out, or just enemy, you know, battles that were quite difficult, and that's nice to see.
Yeah, I think that's as much as we want to give away in terms of the gameplay. Let's just have a quick look at the visual. Now, obviously, it does use that style that we saw in the re-release of, was it Link's Awakening?
Link's Awakening, that lovely plasticine style, which ever since that game was remade, which is one of my favourite games of all time, I've wanted to see that style used again. So I'm delighted to see it used here, and it's definitely had some upgrades in terms of the implementation in Link's Awakening.
Yeah, absolutely. On a technical side, you can definitely see that they're trying to get every last drop of performance out of the Switch. They've gone for 60 frames per second, which is welcome, but you will see, and we did, a couple of drop downs to maybe 30 FPS, like we saw again in Tears of the Kingdom when you use the Ultra Hand ability. It's not necessarily in places like the dungeon, this is more like when you're moving around the open world, but I definitely saw those drops. It looks like there's quite a bit of aliasing, jaggy edges on the edges of characters and things like that. But with all of that said, it still looks lovely. Beautiful, vibrant colour palette, like you say, plasticine style.
There's certainly been an improvement, but as you said, there were, you know, some noticeable bits and bobs too. But just on the colour palette, obviously Zelda as a character, purple is a colour that you would associate with her, and you do see a lot of that in this game. Not necessarily on her, and it does really look lovely.
Big thanks to Nintendo for having us down. It was a really enjoyable game to play so far. We look forward to giving you a full review when the time comes. And do let us know in the comments if there's anything particular that you'd like to know, and if we're able to tell you, we'll let you know.
Do let us know whether you're looking forward to the game as well, which parts of the trailer have piqued your interest, what are you looking forward to in terms of those mechanics. And just to thank you before we go to our patrons for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.